in our Sunday school class, so James and Reuben know all about this. You could do this tonight if you really wanted. We've been doing through this part of the story. I think we started further back than Moses, but we've done right through relatively recently from Moses, right there in the bulrushes, the Israelites as slaves, right through to this point, and we have actually just got slightly past at this point in the story. So the background is, as I'm sure many of you know, that the Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and they cry out to God, and Moses God sets about raising up Moses to be a deliverer to the people. And we know about Moses, the baby in the bulrushes, and how he was brought up in the palace, and how he fled Egypt into the desert, burning bush. There's all different parts of the story that we know well. He goes back, doesn't he, to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh decides, well, no, because I don't want to have to do all the work, and the Israelite slaves are doing it, so no, we're not going to let them go. So we get plagues. There's 10 different plagues, and then they leave. Pharaoh finally says, "Just go, I'm fed up of you, get lost, go." And very quickly he changes his mind and decides to chase after them. After the Israelites. And then we get the Red Sea, don't we? The Red Sea, where how did Moses cross the Red Sea? The chorus goes, doesn't it? And the sea parts, and they cross the go, and then it comes flooded in back behind on Pharaoh's chariots. And then we get a long period in the wilderness. They've been promised the promised land of the children of Israel, and they send the spies in, and another chorus. 12 men went to spy in Canaan, 10 were bad, 2 were good. And the spies go in and they come back saying, "No, we can't do it, they're too big, they're too strong, we just cannot possibly beat these people." And so they get angry again and upset, and are angry towards God for bringing them out of Egypt. And then they have to wander in the desert for 40 years. And God looks after them through all that time. He provides water out of rocks. He provides manna from heaven. They get fed up of that. They're complaining all the time. He provides quail. And it's a wonderful picture of God's provision through those times. And yet they're constantly grumpy, ungrateful, and are fed up. And then we get to the bit last week when we had Alistair with us, and he spoke of them crossing the river again, and there they are, the promised land. And that's where this part of the story comes in, there in chapter 5, verse 13. They're there, they're ready. There's big cities in front of them. Verse 13 of chapter 5. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. There we have Joshua. He's leading these people faced with this big task, and he meets a man. And he asks, when the man says, "I am the commander of the Lord's army," he says to him, "What message has the Lord got for me?" What a great thing to ask when faced with this great task, to come to God and ask, "What have you to say to me in this situation right now?" Joshua, here he was a high-ranking leader. He was in charge of the children of Israel, but yet he realised that God's will was above his. God's direction and God's leading was above his own preconceived ideas. He was willing to listen to and to obey God, willing to submit to him. How wonderful that is for him as a leader to be willing to submit to God. And then we read in chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, that God has a plan. God has a plan for Joshua to follow. It says that now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites, and no one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Make 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast on the trumpets. Make all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in. Now, when we got to this part of the story in Sunday school, I said to the Sunday school class, I said, if you were faced with this problem in front of this huge city with massive walls, I read somewhere, don't ask me how they'll know, that the walls were up to 20 feet thick and 25 feet high. How they know, I don't know, so that's not my saying, that's where I read something. But this was a pretty impressive wall. It says that, don't we know that Rahab's house was on the wall or in the wall or part of the wall, so it must have been a substantial structure. Now 20 feet, I would suggest, is not quite as wide as this room. I would guess this room will be 25 to 30 feet, and 25 feet high is far higher than this room. It was a big structure. So I said to our class, I said, how are you going to defeat this city? And we had all sorts of ideas. I think we had some thought we would maybe get a battering ram. James was going to get an aeroplane and bomb it. I think Reuben was going to have a jackhammer. Yeah, Reuben was going to get a jackhammer to take the wall down. It was certainly in Bible times, how do you get through this wall? It was almost an impossible task. An impossible task. But yet God had a plan. God had a plan. It's surprising, isn't it, how often if we heard God's plan and took it in a human way, you'd think, well, that's ridiculous. How can walking around a city a few more times on another day, shout a bit, and it just doesn't make sense, does it? It's a bit like in the New Testament, isn't it, when there was the 5,000 men plus women and children, and they were hungry and needed something to eat, and they'd 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus prays and blesses it and says to the disciples, distribute it. Now, if I was a disciple, I'd be thinking, well, can't you see the people? 5 loaves and 2 fish should barely feed the row of Huddlestons halfway back. How can this food go amongst so many people? But yet, when they stepped out in faith, did as they were asked, how marvellous God worked through that situation. We see, don't we, in verse 2 of chapter 6, the message that was given to Joshua. See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. You see, the battle is won. What a huge confidence for Joshua. The battle was already won. All they needed to do was obey. It's the same for us too, isn't it? The war is won. It doesn't mean that it'll be easy and we'll have difficulties and little skirmishes and battles on earth. We're told that that our life here on earth is a battle. But the victory has been won. We know through Jesus on the cross. So from this little bit of the story, we can learn that if God's telling us to do something, just do it. It might not make sense necessarily. We might think, well, is that really the best way of doing it? But if we're sure God's told us to do it, just get on and do it. Do it exactly as he said. And now, we've all heard preachers speak who say, oh, well, the 5th word of the 8th line and the second chapter of the 1st verse, and it says this, so that means this, and maybe read something into this text that isn't really there. And I'm maybe going to do a little bit of that here. But in that little passage that I just read from chapter 6, verses 2 to 5 there, where we're looking at the plan that God has, at the middle of that plan, you'll see that there's God. At the middle of that plan, we've got the bit at the beginning, the bit at the end, and in the middle it says, make 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. We have God at the centre of the plan. Am I reading too much into it? Maybe I am a little bit. But certainly it's a biblical principle to keep God at the centre of our plans. To keep God at the centre of all that we do. Now for some here, maybe it's courting, maybe it's marriage, maybe it's homes and families. Is God considered in this situation? Maybe it's a business meeting at church. We have our AGM on Thursday. Maybe you're involved in youth work, maybe in Sunday school. Maybe it's just a church meeting. Maybe something at the Lund Youth Group, a business meeting there. Is God at the centre of those plans? Maybe it's business, maybe it's work, maybe it's our pastimes, the things that we do in our spare time. Do the decisions made bring glory to God? In this part of God's plan for the children of Israel, as they approached the problem of the wall of Jericho, we find that we have the Ark of the Covenant, which is a visible sign of God to the people. And also we have the trumpets, an audible sign of God's presence. Ark represents the presence of God amongst his people. And the trumpets would be the ones that would be used in religious festivals and feasts. Now, there may be some here, we've all done it, who have already wandered off, their mind's wandered off, and you're paying no attention to me at all. There are things that come in and distract us, aren't there? Maybe we're thinking about what we've got to do next week, and you've already forgotten anything I've said. And we've all done it, I've done it, we've all done that, haven't we? But I think these two things at the centre of God's plan were to keep God's people focused. They had a visual and an audible reminder of God in this situation. I think they are two of the biggest and most common ways that we are distracted, aren't we, through what we see and what we hear. Two of the ways that we are so easily turned from God and his plans for us. We're easily distracted through our eyes and ears, through what we see and what we hear. We have the example again in the New Testament of Peter, don't we, as he's walking on the water, and the Bible says that when he sees the waves and he hears the wind, he starts to sink. But when he looks to Jesus and listens to him, he's okay. And that reminds us, doesn't it, of the importance in the midst of the turmoil of life, in the midst of the situation, in the heat of the battle, to keep our eyes focused on God. You see, when the children of Israel, the Israelites, when they were walking around the walls, it would be so easy, wouldn't it, to look at those walls and think, these are huge walls. They would be dwarfed by the walls as they walked round. Little people, 5, 6, 7 feet tall, and these walls 25 feet. It'd be easy, wouldn't it, to look at the walls and think, well, this is never going to work. How are these ever going to come down? But their focus was kept on God, on God's plan for them, on what he had in store for them. In every area of life, we've to look to God and we've to listen to him. And then we find in verses 6 through to 16 that the children of Israel set to and they follow the plan. They follow the plan. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and trumpets in front of it. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpet. The ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the people returned to camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. You see, the people followed the plan exactly. I was watching only last night, was it last night? One night in the last couple, a gardening programme. And these people were doing this gardening. Now, I'll be honest, I sort of drifted in and out of sleep a little bit during the programme. But I got the impression at the end that they had a builder in who was doing the hard landscaping. That's building the walls and the features. And he was saying how much easier it is if you've got a plan to follow, rather than somebody's ideas. This particular person just said, I sort of want a wall maybe sort of there, about sort of so high, and I want a sort of a round thing here. And he was very frustrated, was this builder man, this landscape gardener, because there'd been no plan and it didn't look how it should. Builders like plans to follow, then it does what it says on the tin. You see here in Joshua we read that Joshua and the people, they follow God's plan. It took faith, it took belief that God would do what he said. You know, in many respects it's a crazy thing to do. The people inside the city, I'm sure they'd be sat on the walls on days thinking, what are these people doing? Just wandering around in a circle and going back to the tents. Wandering about round and then going to the tents. They'd think they were crazy. It takes faith to follow God. But they followed God's plan exactly. They followed it exactly. And then in verses 17 to 20 we have some special instructions. Some special instructions. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. So there's two special instructions. First of all, we have Rahab was to be spared. Rahab and all who was in her family, all who were in her house were to be spared. Rahab. It tells us that Rahab was a prostitute. She would be a woman of low reputation. And you think, why would that be the person that's to be spared? Well, I'm sure many of you know the story back in Joshua and chapter 2, where the spies have gone in to look round Jericho, and the king is after them. Someone's told him that there's two spies in the city. So they go into this house, it's Rahab's house, and she looks after them, she hides them on the roof. Now, did they spare Rahab? Did the children of Israel spare Rahab just because she'd done a good thing? The answer to that is no, isn't it? It's not just because she had done a good thing. You know, many people in life think that if they do some good things, that they will one day be spared. They think that if they do good things, that will get them to heaven. If they do good things, God will forgive them. But we read it in verse 11 of chapter 2, and this, I believe, is a reason why Rahab was spared. When we heard of it, this is Rahab speaking, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. You see, Rahab realised who God was and what he was about. And that was why Rahab was spared. You see, many people in life try to find favour with God because they've done a good thing. But it's only by acknowledging who God is, as Rahab did, that we can be sure of eternity in heaven. And then we have the second instruction, the second special instruction about the silver and the gold and the bronze and the iron. And it says that that's to be given into God's treasury. All the valuable things have to be given to God and to his house. And I often think that would be such a difficult thing for the people. I'm sure they'd think to themselves, well, if we just kept a bit for ourselves, that would see us through, we'd have enough. It's a very human thing, isn't it, to think if we can just get enough stuff, we'll be all right. It'll see us through for a few years. But they were told to give it all to God. They're to give it all to God. You see, that's man's perspective, isn't it? To store enough If we keep enough, if we do enough for ourselves, we'll be okay. It'll help to look after me. Often we try to keep the best and give God what's left. If our plans and decisions are what suits us, what we think are best for us, then if we've time, we try to find God, we try to fit God in around that. If that's what we're doing, then we've got things in the wrong order. We shouldn't try to fill our lives with things, then fit God in where we can. The children of Israel were reminded constantly to keep their focus on God, to make sure their relationship with Him was right, and to rely on the constant, unchanging, and all-powerful God. See, by giving what was valuable to God, by giving it over to Him, they demonstrated who was the Lord in their lives. Do we give God of our best, or just give Him what's left? Whether that's our time, do we fill our lives with the things we want to do, and then if there's a bit of spare time on a Sunday, we maybe pop to church? Or in the morning, if we've time, we'll maybe do our Bible readings, but only if we've time. Or maybe our effort, the things that we spend our energy on. Do we spend any energy getting to know God? Or maybe it's our money. Do we rely, as these children of Israel could have done, on thinking, well, if we just keep enough for us? But they didn't, they were willing to give it to God. Or maybe it's our skills, the things that we're good at. Do we like to use them to further our position in life? Or do we use them to further God's? And then in verses 20 to 25, we see that God keeps His promises. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep and donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab, the prostitute, and her family, and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. In the eyes of the world, in human eyes, what are the chances of that wall falling down? See, the people within that city, they were trusting in that wall. That wall was 20 feet by 25 feet. Just walking around it. I'm sure the people inside, they thought, well, what are they up to? Are they trying to make us dizzy? This is a huge wall. How are they going to get in? Human nature puts its trust in what it can see. Our human nature is to put our trust in the things that we think we can control. I remember many years ago, soon after I started work, I had a bank account at the HSBC. It was the Midland originally, and then it went to the HSBC, and they convinced me to open up a pension. Now, I've nothing against pensions. I'm sure there's some people out there with very good pensions, but I had this here pension, and every year I had to go in for an annual review. And one year I went in and he gave me the figures, and it said that at the start, these are just, I don't know the exact figures, but we'll say at the start of the year I had £1,000 in this pension, and I'd put in £400 over the year, and at the end of the year it was worth £1,200. And I looked at this figure and I thought to myself, I don't think your calculator's working. I said, because 1,000 plus 400 equals 1,400. But you see, it's 1,200. Oh, well, shares have gone down. Shares have happened to go down. Now, me being the sort of person who likes to trust in things I can see, thought I'm not having any of this because I have no control over these shares. So I said to the man, I said, well, I'm going to stop my pension. And he said, well, why? So, well, I said 2 years ago, I said, I bought a calf. in Lancaster auction. I said it was an Angus heifer, it cost me £2. I said, and it's just had a calf. And I said, it's probably worth £800 now. So I said, in 2 years, I've turned £2 into £800. It's not quite as simple as that if anyone's thinking of taking up farming. It's not quite as easy as that. But I said to him, I said, I can see that calf. I said, I have some control over that calf. In my mind, I thought I had some control over that situation. So I said, I'm not having aught to do with your shares that I have no control over. And that's a very human thing, isn't it? We like to put our trust in things that we think we can control. You know, maybe it is our bank balance, maybe it's our homes. We think we're in charge. We think we can control them. But as it happened, that cow actually died. But that proves the point, doesn't it? I thought I was in control. I thought I was doing right because I have this £800 cow here, mate. And it turns out I wasn't. I couldn't control it. It was beyond my control. The people of Jericho, their trust, their hope was in what they'd done. It was in what they'd built, a wall. But it all came crashing down. The children of Israel put their trust in what God had done and in what God can do. And God saw them through. He did what he promised. So in closing, when facing a task, whether large or small, in what or who do you trust? Ask God to reveal his plan and purpose in the situation. Keep him at the centre. Ask, does this bring me closer to God? Does this keep me focused on God? Fill your eyes and ears with the things of God and give God our best, not just what's left. Let's not put our trust in what we can do, but let's put our trust in what Jesus has already done for us on the cross, and remember that God always keeps his promises. Let's pray.